Great. Okay. So thank you all for being here. This is the session titled What's in a Capstone? Exploring Features of Online Graduate Level Capstones. And this will be presented by Melissa DeWitt, who is with the University of Denver. And I will hand it over.
Thank you. And hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. We are going to be talking about my current obsession, which is capstones, and specifically graduate level and online, because we are at an e-learning conference. So just to get us started, my name is Melissa DeWitt, as mentioned. Just wanted to start by introducing myself a little bit. I am an instructional designer and I work for the University of Denver. I specifically work for University College, and that college supports graduate programs that are predominantly online, and usually for career-focused programs. I was also formerly a librarian. I did research and instruction, and I worked with capstones across a variety of disciplines, a bunch of different students, and also helped faculty think about their capstones as well. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of talking about capstones today. I figured I would put learning outcomes up for us, as is good practice, and because instructional design, that's what we do. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to discuss various features, goals, challenges in creating and delivering capstones, and then also recommend new ideas to enhance existing capstone courses, or if you're making one from scratch. And then this is our agenda for the day in terms of what we'll be talking through with capstones. So I want to start by defining what do I even mean by capstone, types of capstones based on the literature, my experience, or things that we found out there. What is the purpose of one? What are some features that we can find? What are the challenges for students, for instructors, and for designers? And then some implications and takeaways. So we will start by, like I mentioned, defining, and to give you a little bit of context too about some of the stuff I'll be talking about. The first thing you should know is that research specifically on graduate online capstone experiences is sparse. There's not a lot of stuff happening out there. We know this because every article you find will say there's not a lot of research out there. And I also can't find a lot of it. So specific to this, there is a lot of research on undergraduate experiences, and then some of your more like traditional in person. So some of it pulls from that. But just keeping in mind, I'm talking about probably like 10 articles max. And then, like I said, my own experience or people I've talked to. And when there is research that is on capstones, it is really focused on a few case studies. So something that program or those folks tried. Sometimes it's personal experience. And then sometimes it's reviews extrapolating either stuff they found about other types, or just reviewing kind of like the stuff that's already out there. So just know that that's where kind of this is coming from. There's just not a lot of stuff, and there should be more. Okay, there's not a lot of this. And so I'm not making anyone do breakout rooms. You don't have to speak if you don't want to, but I do have a couple pauses in here just for questions, just to see what your experiences are and kind of where you're coming from with capstones. So before I get into definitions, I'm curious about what you all see as what is a capstone. Either what would you define what it is? Why do we do them? You can say I don't know, whatever kind of like your starting thought process is. So I'll give just a minute or so. Feel free to use the chat to answer, or if you would like to unmute, you can go ahead and unmute as well. Okay, thank you, Kristen. I have a project that runs over multiple courses to demonstrate a culmination of learning. Jessica, our beloved moderator, we have a culminating project demonstrating mastery of a discipline or interlocution. Ooh, big, like good language in here too, of a discipline. So yeah, so far, right, like multiple courses or demonstrating mastery, things along those lines. That's awesome. I'll give it like 30 more seconds so I can drink water. My mouth gets so dry when I present. So here we go. What is a capstone? This is my extremely fancy definition. Some sort of culminating thing that appears at the end of a program. And the reason this is my terrible, just not very straightforward definition, right? Like in the chat, you mentioned some features that I will actually get into. So I really appreciate that. But there actually isn't a single definition of a capstone because it turns out everyone is doing just radically different things and are conceptualizing what they are, what should be in them, in various ways, especially in the graduate space. When we're thinking about what's authentic to students or what do we want them to do and take away. And so essentially really the only kind of factor is that they tend to appear at the end. And also keep in mind when I say capstone, sometimes you might hear like a master's thesis. I would consider sort of under this umbrella or projects or things along those lines. So if it sort of fits under that and it's not like the same terminology, I am still counting it and we'll still be talking a little bit about it as well. So I'm going to dive into the types of capstones that we might see. Comes in various different forms. And I'm pulling some of this from an article from it's Blanford et al. 2020 called Merits of Capstone Projects in an Online Graduate Program, this one for working professionals. And so just to highlight some of the things that are mentioned in this box, they looked at a couple different articles and then consolidated and tried to talk about what each of these things are. And so the first one is, I think what most folks traditionally would see as a capstone, which is your like standard academic paper, right? You pick a topic, you develop it, you write a thing. It tends to be related to the program. And as this mentions too, it can be done individually or it can be done as a group. And that means they can choose from options to work with someone. And coming from University College, this is one of the things that we do too. And I would say that it mirrors almost the concept of a dissertation where you're doing a really deep dive into one topic. And sometimes this might appear as conceptualizing a methodology. So you may or may not actually carry out the research project, but you might think about what you would do for methodology, and what you might do if you were to find results and implications for this. This tends to be really academic and kind of more of the traditional thing we think of. And then next is externally oriented projects or simulations that are externally oriented. And this is more like a culminating internship experience where you can go work somewhere or you can simulate a work environment. This is actually what I did for my master's degree, where we had a culminating internship where I worked in a specific area. We had projects that were really focused on gaining professional skills and experience. And you might think of like healthcare, going and getting real world experience and professional experience to see if you like that environment too. That can be a type of culminating or capstone experience as well. And then this one also mentions externally oriented academic inquiry project. Big terms for a lot of these types of projects. But in this one, you choose a work-related problem. And so that's the external portion. And that's the big difference between the first and the last, is the first is topic-oriented and maybe interest, but doesn't have to be based anywhere, versus this type of project is based in a workplace. And is still sort of an academic-y thing that you might write or that you might conceptualize. You usually have guidelines on what you were supposed to do with this. Though there are some options mentioned in the literature that included partnering with a team in a school, for instance, where a teacher was in their own workplace. They gathered some of their colleagues and they found a problem and then worked through it and wrote about that process as part of their capstone. Another included finding an organization and then creating some sort of training course for them. And then some things that were not mentioned in this paper that I also have found either in the literature or again in experience. So like reflective journeys, a course where you look back and you go through like a little journey on all of the stuff that you've done. This is really prominent in teacher focused programs where they created a course where students look back at their work and applied it to their own teaching philosophy and practice. Portfolios are another thing that comes up as, again, whether that's a capstone or a portfolio, a culminating thing, where you can put it together for internal or external purposes. So that might be for internal assessment where there's an artifact from every course, and you use that artifact to see if students met program outcomes based on the thing that they presented in their portfolio. Or it can be external facing, so practical for a professional program where you've created a design portfolio, for instance, and you can bring that to a job interview and you'd be able to show what you've done as a result of your program. I also did not highlight the bottom of this page in the slides that mentioned a couple of things too. One of which is independent projects, where there actually isn't a structure at all. Students just propose what they want to do. And then they work with someone one-on-one who's usually their advisor or an instructor, and they help them conceptualize and make that thing. So really unstructured and just sort of free form based on the student and based on the advisor. And then there are also more directed projects where students are given the same instruction or same thing to work on to create something. So there's an article that mentions a medical case study analysis where they were each given different medical case studies and they had to do some sort of creation project analysis based around those. So really structured, really directed thing that they made as a culmination. So we have talked about essentially the format that these projects can take, that these papers, whatever they might end up looking like. I want to dive into purposes or end goals. Like, why are we doing these? Which was also mentioned a little bit in the chat of like, is it to demonstrate learning? Is it to show ability of a discipline? It turns out, similar to our definition, it is a lot of things. It can be anything you want, essentially. So what I've done here is pulled main themes from a variety of papers and in places that tend to appear kind of over and over of like, why are capstones being done? So starting with reflection, you're going to see this kind of across the board, but like thought about in a couple different ways. So one way of having a reflective space to solidify professional identity, growth, and learning. So this was a space where at the end of it, it was reflecting very specifically on skills and then how they could move forward. So this kind of weaves through all of these themes. I should have made it an umbrella, but I did not. So in a teaching one specifically, they looked at going through their process and then ended up coming with a teaching philosophy and purpose at the end. And that was the end goal of that capstone, for instance. Another one is knowledge synthesis. And so this is where you take all of the knowledge that you've learned throughout your program and then you synthesize it together into something that can either be applied or that just reflects your knowledge. So that could be like your really traditional capstone paper where you're pulling in that synthesis, or it can be more intentional where they're trying to pull from very specific core classes that were taken and have them synthesize that information. Another one, growth. So one was the capstone as an opportunity to not instill knowledge, but rather bring a holistic understanding to students' educational journeys. So growing as a student, growing into something professionally, or just growing into like the skills that they've learned after. Identity, I mentioned a little bit too. So that could be the identity of like you as a student, you as a practitioner. beyond this like educational process you've gone through, who are you? And designing a capstone that is really focused on core identities that you want students to take away with and bring into the next chapter of whatever they're doing. Applied. So this goes along the lines with some of those external projects that folks can do where they take the skills that they've learned and they actively apply it somewhere. And so that might be applying it for a project. I mentioned doing something like creating a training for an organization. So taking a lot you've learned and applying it into this one little project. And then additionally, helping students transition. So having them look backward in integrating their work and then transitioning and looking forward to the next thing. As interwoven through this too, some of this can also be like synthesis or growth to evaluate program outcomes. So you can evaluate program outcomes in a capstone, or some folks don't do that at all. And it's about individual learning and what happens next. So like I mentioned, lots of different purposes and end goals and ways of thinking about a capstone. Okay, so this all sounds like it's kind of the same stuff, but I want to clarify when I am thinking about features, these are things that people do or add as part of their culminating or capstone experiences. So how do they frame them? How long are they? What do they look like? And this is again, because this is the theme, there's not one way to do it. There's just lots of stuff that you can do as a feature or a component of the capstone. And you'll see some of these are features of undergraduate or maybe not specifically online capstones as well. But one thing to keep in mind for graduate students that is pointed out as a big difference is a lot of graduate students are already working or might currently have jobs in the workplace too. And so some of this in the features capitalizing that or helping transition to sort of like the next step within like this identity that they're already part of, versus a lot of undergraduate capstones focus on transitioning students from being student to just go and living in the world or whatever it is people do next. So going through just a few of these really quickly, there was one great article that mentioned they did an assessment of the industry they were working in. So it was computer science focused, and they created essentially like a list of skills that they wanted their graduate students to leave with. And after they did that inventory, they had this list of soft and then interactive skills as well. And they created their capstone with that in mind of like, how do we make sure all of these things are reflected as part of this? So doing an inventory of skills, especially if you're a really career focused program, is one feature that has been tried as well. In quite a few, in my experience too, the prep workshop. And so this is in preparation for the capstone, whether that is the paper project, whatever it might be, where you identify your project idea, you review example capstones, you start finding resources, you understand what help is available on campus. And some of these can be like semester long. There are some that are like 3 weeks. It really just kind of depends on the capstone and what they came up with. I got to participate in one as a librarian that was just 4 sessions, but it was about 2 hours each. And we went through the steps of like, how do you brainstorm topics? How do you do topic development? Where do you find stuff? What does it mean to synthesize sources and write a literature review? And then after that workshop, they actually individually did their capstone. There was no course after it. They just worked one-on-one with an advisor to check in and write their whole paper over the course of the next semester. Which leads into paired with capstone advisors. If it isn't necessarily a course itself that people are part of, sometimes people are paired one-on-one with an advisor to complete the capstone. And even if it's a course, you might sometimes have an instructor or have an outside advisor who is helping facilitate and move the project forward, or paper, whatever it is. Another thing that's interesting outside of advisors are some pieces of the literature talked about having industry mentors for capstone feedback. So if they were especially doing a work-based project, the student might be responsible for identifying a mentor And that person would read through and give feedback that was industry related to that actual capstone project. Or the program might find a list of mentors that students could reach out to. And again, it's the same concept of, are you applying the industry focused stuff that we're hoping for and getting mentorship from that? Some other features are programs at the end would allow students to present or publish. So the end goal of it being that you have this big presentation that you give, either to the people who were really involved with it, to the place that you did it for, or one facilitated publication. And that was a requirement if they had to either present or publish. And that was part of the requirement to get out because they wanted it to be a really professional, applicable piece that students could take away. More reflection. As I mentioned, a running theme throughout all of these. And in this case, reflection as an action, an active process through a lot of different types. So even for capstones doing like more academic end papers, having a reflective process where students did things like think about their writing choices. How did they do research? Why did they frame evidence this way? Or also reflection of what did I learn in previous classes that I can apply here? So connecting the reflection active process with application to what they were doing and applying to the capstone. So a little bit different than just like thinking back and moving forward, but like, what am I doing and why am I doing this? Authentic learning experiences, a hallmark of every good adult learning theory. Right. So the idea that adults like doing things that are practical and applied and that are authentic to what they're already doing. This is a thing that is mentioned kind of over and over of like, I want an end capstone where it's authentic. It's something that they are doing or that they should do that is applied. That tends to be a thing that's thought through quite a lot of like, how do I make this really, really authentic? And then I mentioned two various lengths of capstone. So some are multi-semester, some are throughout the entire program. Some are a single 10-week quarter, or right, like, or shorter or longer. There is no standard length of time that when I was looking through, that people were completing capstones in. And so that is another factor of like, how long should this be? There is no standard. It is whatever I guess your constraints are, and whatever you can envision as part of that too. Okay, so I just talked to you for like quite a bit. I'm gonna break it up now and ask you a question. So that was a lot of information. I am just curious on your experiences too. What kinds of capstones have you completed as a student or maybe taught as an educator or you've designed, like whatever kinds of things you've seen. And you can answer in the chat, or you are welcome to unmute if you are feeling chatty. I'll give us a few minutes to think about that. But also really thinking, do they reflect some of the things here? Is there something different that you've seen as part of this too? And I will take a drink of water. Awesome. Thank you. So like a academically like real world based of like choosing something based out there that's like practical, but we're writing a paper about it. Awesome. And then in the chat too, having a portfolio capstone, which was instructional design based, does make a lot of sense. And that is something I haven't mentioned. So thank you for pointing that out too, of thinking about like what is either the profession or program, like what kind of culminating capstone makes sense for that. Is it a portfolio because people use that a lot in that industry? Or is it something that is more communication oriented because that's how that industry works? So thank you both for sharing those. I'll give us just a few more minutes in case anyone else wants to respond. I also know we're getting to the end of the day. We're like the brain is doing its most.
I'll just unmute so you don't have to awkwardly wait for 2 minutes while I finish typing this sentence.
Thanks.
Um, so yeah, traditional dissertation style in like undergrad, grad, and PhD. But I did an architecture minor, and I love the way that A schools do like you kind of put together like a physical portfolio, and then experts like walk about and like ask you questions, and you kind of like talk through your work, and then they will sort of give you a critique. They're very nice, but maybe some architecture schools are not so nice. But I thought that was kind of cool too, that kind of panel of experts to share your stuff with.
Yeah, that's really cool because it almost merges like the mentor concept of like having, maybe they didn't give feedback along the way, but at the end, looking through and either critiquing, like you said nicely, hopefully you don't have like a jerk who comes in. And also doing like that presentation. So you actually like are showing people what you did, and like merging those things together sounds really cool. Almost like a poster presentation too that you could do.
Yeah, very much so.
And then Kara asked too, would you happen to know the history of the graduate capstone among all the different types? Is the like academic traditional? I actually don't know the origin. Now I feel like I should, and that's going to be on my agenda for after this presentation. But I don't, it has always been like, as far as you can like find stuff, that's been just sort of a mainstay in like higher ed. And I have to imagine it's just like from some of these origins of like what we expect from students in academic context, and especially right, like I'm talking a lot about like professional graduate programs, but that isn't necessarily always like what has been out there. If you're doing like an English master's degree, or if you're doing like if you were doing philosophy or something like that, that isn't necessarily like, I mean, philosophy is a profession, but if you're not going into a specific industry, you know what I mean? That being like a more papery, kind of like traditional way of doing things. And so I think it's just something we've held on to, but that's a great question. I would love to explore like the origin of the essay. Which if anyone else knows, please chime in. I would love to know that immediately. Great, we'll all find out later. Okay. Thanks for asking that too. Okay, so to this point, I've talked about like the actual thing of capstone project paper presentation, like whatever format that takes in. But I haven't talked about the people who are creating it, teaching it, completing it. And so in this section, I want to highlight some of the challenges that surface. And by challenges, I mean like for students, what gets in the way of completion, or just like what makes people really frustrated or like cry, or just kind of stress out about completing something like this. And then on the design and instructor side, like what are some of the things that are we see where we're like, wow, this isn't what I hoped the end product would be. It feels like things are missing, or I didn't know about this, and I didn't know to apply it, and I wish I would have. So that's kind of how I'm structuring challenges. And I want to start by highlighting students, and starting with this quote, which is the idea of a thesis block. And we are going a little back in history on this one, because this actually originates, it's Rennie and Brewer in 1987. They described a phenomenon of the thesis block, and that is the difficulty some students have transitioning from a really structured classroom model to the self-directed learning that's inherent in many master's degree capstone and thesis requirements. So I wanted to highlight this because a lot of times, right, classrooms are content focused. You have a certain subject area, you're talking about a really specific thing. There's ideas about how to master like those skills and understand the concepts. Versus a capstone, you're still teaching a thing, right? But what you're teaching is how to do the capstone. And it isn't as content focused. Students really have to drive their own content a lot of times. And think about what is my topic? How do I want to move forward with this? What are my ideas being applied? And so we might do that in the other classes, or especially in core classes. But for a lot of students, this just doesn't feel the same. This is like a really, really different way of engaging with their learning, where now they're the ones who are driving everything, and the instructor is really facilitating like that process versus being the person guiding, depending on like your teaching style or how your classrooms are structured. But this is a lot of times the case of like a roadblock of like, I just don't know how to do learning this way. And it's not the only challenge that students face. Um, a lot of these are going to kind of merge with each other as well, but a lot of it stemming from the idea of preparation. In a lot of surveys, in a lot of people I've talked to, a lot of students crying in my office, preparation and not knowing and not feeling ready to do something of this nature. Again, the giant paper, writing skills being one of them. I just don't know how to write this. I've never done writing this way, or right, whether that is the literature review, I just have never done one, or one of this scale or this scope. Or I don't know how to like synthesize information like this, or like I don't understand the audience, or like how I'm writing a method section. That kind of thing tends to pop up with preparation. And then the other one being research skills. Again, as a former librarian, this is like an area that I've also seen a lot of and is really, really present in student anxieties about capstones. And it's the idea of like, I don't know how to find what you're asking me to do. I've seen it where all of a sudden they're being asked to find right primary medical literature about their very narrow topic, and they're like, I don't even know what primary literature is. I am not prepared for this. Versus like history primary literature, which is radically different. Or I'm still not sold on what peer review is. That being a thing where it's like, oh, I thought that would come up, but like students just don't feel like they know these things, and now they're being asked to do them. Another one, which is not unique to online and not unique to graduates or even students, time. A big thing is students underestimating how long things would take. And so thinking they had a plan for it and then being like, oh Lord, this is like taking forever. And then if also considering too, like things pop up in our lives all the time. And so if you're kind of not sure on how long a thing takes and then things are popping up, it's really, really easy to get behind and get really stressed. If we are thinking just specifically about our online graduate students, a lot of them are taking online classes for a specific reason. A lot of times because they need to do it on their own time. They can't do a traditional format because they have kids. They're working full time. They don't have a university close by. They have a lot of responsibilities. And so being able to do it on like weekends or whatever is beneficial for them. And so things might pop up more so than usual. And then we add the stress of the capstone, whatever format that is on it. And time just becomes a really huge factor. Topic selection. So this also kind of goes into preparation. And I did mention those like prep classes that some capstones have. Students have a really hard time just choosing and narrowing in on a topic. So if we go back to the idea that this is sort of a new format to them, and it might be larger than they're used to. If like the longest paper they've written is 10 pages, and now we're like, okay, write 30. They might not know how to scope it, or figure out like what does a topic need to look like in order to write this kind of thing. And they might think to go really big, but then you're like, you should just get a PhD and write a dissertation. Versus right, like, oh, it's too small or too small, it should be 10. So even just scoping and topic development. And then a quote from an article too, this is Mowbray 2015. In particular, we discovered that in most cases, students were simply not prepared for the task of formulating an appropriate essay topic. Again, this insight revealed our unacknowledged assumption that postgraduate students would have this level of sophistication with their thinking. So there was an assumption that they would just be able to develop a topic and maybe not support for it. This again goes back to the thesis block, the idea of independence. They just weren't ready or didn't know how to take ownership of a project like this, and what it meant to like lead and just be part of this. And so that either prevented students from completing or just caused like high levels of anxiety that maybe didn't need to be there. This one I found really interesting, actually, which was the idea of taking theory into practice, especially if it was like a workplace or org-based thing that they were trying to do with their capstone. And so students would struggle with a lack of understanding of thesis requirements is one thing, and the ability to match current practice in their organization with the theory they were learning, while then presenting their research work and findings in an academic format. So there's kind of like a genre mixing happening here where you're learning all this theory, you're supposed to apply it in your organization, but you can't recognize it in your organization. It's just not tracking for some reason. And also your organization is not academic, but now you got to make it academic. And they were like, what? So that being a challenge for some students who are like, I don't know how to merge these worlds in the way that you're asking me to. A lack of resources. I've mentioned this a little bit already. It goes with preparation. Students felt they just didn't have resources they needed to succeed. And also keeping in mind, if students aren't campus-based, if they're not even location in the same state, they might not know what's available if it hasn't really been shown throughout a program. Because a lot of times there's an assumption of campus-based students and online students get kind of forgotten on resources. So unless it's really explicitly like in the class or presented from the instructor, they might feel as if there is a lack of resources, even though there's an abundance. So pointing that out could have helped some of the students too. And then the last one I'll highlight for students is they sometimes felt in the online format a real lack of communication and support. So especially from their instructor, where they're like, I can't get a hold of them. They're not talking to me. Like, I'm just swimming alone trying to make this work and graduate on time. And so this like lack of presence and the ability to even talk to classmates. Sometimes there wasn't even a way to like just chat and have a little bit of support from peers. So we've thought about students. I'm going to talk about designer instructor challenges, and you're going to see some common themes because they really play off each other. If students are feeling away, it could be coming from here, or it could be, right, just everyone is feeling the same and now we're all stressed. But some of the things that are popping up on the instructor side are instructors who felt they didn't know how to mentor students actually. They were great at teaching, they were great at working with students, but they didn't know how to like mentor them through this kind of paper or project or thing. They just like knew what they knew, right? And they were like, I don't know what they don't know. I don't know how to like mentor them or get them to do this either. And then the other one, going back to student communication, instructors didn't know how to facilitate communication. So they either didn't realize how much they should be communicating with students online, or they didn't know how to facilitate communication between students so that they could feel supported and have a community with each other. And all of that actually leading into this idea of preparation. Another quote that I'll pull out mentions it's important to take into consideration that faculty members teaching an online capstone require support not only for the particular demands of online teaching, which is very different than in person, but for the markedly different task of teaching a capstone rather than a content-centered course. So not feeling like they knew about this kind of shift in the way that the classroom was. And so they just didn't know how to prepare for it and were like doing their best. And then going into kind of a mishmash of designer and instructor challenges, the assumptions one being a really, really big thing that kind of happens over and over. And it's the assumption that students know stuff and they don't. They know skills, they already know how to like do research, they already know how to write a paper, so why isn't this translating? And then not providing the type of support or resources that students felt they then needed. And so students feel like they're thrown into it without being taught. And then instructors are like, wait, why don't you know this? And then everyone's sad. The second that I'll talk about that goes into it is sort of like lack of resources that goes along with the assumptions. So the idea, right, if you assume people know things, you might not put in the resources that they really need in order to succeed. And again, that idea of like, if we're online, do students know about online help and resources that are anchored on campus traditionally? So are we sufficiently telling them like how to do things or how to find the support that they need? Disconnected, and from that, disconnected from the curriculum. So the idea that we have this culminating thing and students are doing it, Did we teach them any of the skills we're now asking in the capstone? So again, going into our assumptions and lack of resources, did we do a deep dive into our curriculum, our core courses, our like extra courses, things like that? Can we look back and say, oh, we did teach students how to do a literature review here? So hopefully that translates. Or, oh, we have been talking about resources throughout, or like research is threaded throughout. And I'm not talking about like one course, right? Like, oh, they took this like one course, so it should translate. Like, did they take one course a year ago? Because I can barely remember it last week. So trying to come up with methodology in my capstone that I learned about like months ago is just not going to be awesome. So that disconnect of like, does our curriculum align with our capstone? There is also this idea, there's a debate, there's a heated debate about new content in a capstone. So whether or not new content should actually be introduced in the experience, some authors suggest that no new content should be introduced in a capstone. You should just go into it and they should already know everything. And then on the other hand, there's actually folks who think that you have to introduce entirely new theoretical material in order to achieve the aims of a capstone experience. So I think this divide stems from different goals and different things that we want our capstones to do. And so whether or not new content should go in or new content should not be introduced should maybe just depend on the structure and what you're trying to help students get out of it. But that being a design struggle of like, wait, do I put this stuff in here or like, should I not do that at all? And like everything, there is no answer. There's just vibes. And then lastly, I have on here time, much like students' time. And by time, I mean constraints of A, how long do we have to design this? B, what if I'm doing this in a quarter, am I structured by my quarter system, by my semester system? Do I have these sort of like things, these forces outside of what I want the capstone to be that are telling me I have to do time this way, so I can't do a prep course, or I have to like do things within a certain time frame? So like time itself and like how long you have to work with students being a large factor of like our design and our instruction too. How much can we really do? Just depending on how much time we have to do these experiences. So back to you. Before I get into our last bit of implications and takeaways, do any of these resonate with you? Are there other struggles or challenges that you've seen either as a student, instructor, or designer, or ones you can think of? Maybe you haven't seen it, but you're like, I bet this is an issue. And kind of what are those things? Again, chat if you are feeling like typing, or unmuting if you want to say a thing. And I will sip water while you think.
I'll chime in. I did a portfolio for my instructional design master's, and um like while it was helpful in kind of a metacognitive way for me to look back on my learning and assemble all of these like artifacts I had created, it did feel disconnected from what was expected by like the industry, if that makes sense. And um I don't, it could be because many of the professors were mainly academia based, and as everyone knows, instructional design covers a lot of different areas, like from corporate to like government. Um, so I felt like my portfolio wasn't as versatile as it could have been. Um, but maybe that's more of a like comment on the program. Um, but yeah, just like, and also kind of being asked to incorporate these like old projects that like 2 years later looked very, very beginner in a in a portfolio. But I did appreciate like, being forced to put something together that I might not otherwise have made time for on my own. So yeah, this is just kind of a personal reflection there.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point because I felt that way in my program too, where I was like, y'all haven't like done the work in decades and you're asking me to do these things, and it's deeply disconnected from like what I'm actually doing professionally, because everyone in my program was like working in libraries or doing some sort of internship, and then you would like be taught or kind of asked to do something and you were like, this isn't it anymore. And so I can see that as a capstone problem too, of like, is this actually what the industry is doing? Should be maybe a question we ask if we're doing an industry-based thing. Or the question of portfolio. I think it'd be interesting to reflect on your projects and think about growth of being like, this does feel really beginner. Like, why and what would I change now? That could be really cool as like a growth thing of doing it. But I like sometimes if I read or watch things I've done in the past, I'm like, I just don't want to do it. I'm like horrified. And then also in the chat, the theme of students should already know how to do this. Instructors from assignment skills that require additional skills. And I feel like that's honestly like really the most common challenge. It's just this idea that like, oh, they already know it, especially with graduate students. Because it's like, oh, they did undergrad. Like how long ago, and was it connected to the graduate program? That tends to just like make everyone struggle. And again, no one's happy. So thanks for input on that one too. And I keep talking about time being a challenge. Here I am, challenged with time. So in the last like 2 or 3 minutes, I will end with some implications and takeaways. And really the biggest ones being intentional and thoughtful. That's like, this sounds like really basic, but like, right, like what are we doing? What are the barriers? Like what are our assumptions? Even taking an inventory of that. And how do we make sure online students in particular are connected to these resources so they feel like they can be successful and they aren't left in the dark? Or how can we invite these resources into our experiences so they're actually just like an integral part of it, and make sure that they get to be part of this experience too. So here's a list of takeaways, just briefly going through each one. Define the end goal and the purpose. Like, why are you doing this? Why do you want students to do this capstone? What are they taking away? Are we leaving them with a practical work product? And as we just chatted about too, is it really connected to the thing I want them to do? Are we trying to assess our program by using this experience? Or do we want students to reflect? Can we start by like defining what we want out of this? And then based on that, determine our format. And know that we don't have to limit ourselves. We just saw like a bunch of different options that you could mix and match and just come up with, right? And there's no format is like the thing I learned, which I was really surprised by. Your entire program can be the capstone. I don't know, get creative. You can have a portfolio with a reflective class. You can have workshops. You can do the academic paper. You can absolutely throw it in the trash. Really, like, what do you want the format to be? And how does it connect to your goal and your purpose? Are these things aligned, and are students getting out of it what you really want them to? And then depending on your end product, is your curriculum aligned with this goal? Are there things that need to go back and be added in certain classes? Do we need to do certain preparations so students don't face some of these challenges they're feeling with prep? Like they don't have these skills that maybe can just be taught along the way and slowly like integrated into this final thing that we're doing. Can we just map it? Like if you look at across your curriculum, where are we doing research? Where are we learning writing skills? What are they? And how do they all lead into this final product that we're hoping that students are doing? And where can we support student independence if we're really valuing that as a capstone experience? If we want them to be independent, how do we facilitate and foster that throughout the curriculum? Oh my gosh, I'm out of time. So I'm going to go really fast. Give resources. We've talked about it. Just tell them stuff. Give them mentors. Don't make assumptions. It's online. Put it in the thing so they can go get it. Facilitate communication, especially online. Students want to talk to each other and they want to talk to their instructor or advisor. So be intentional about how we're facilitating that and know that this is like a need that people are looking for. And then support the instructors if they are facilitating. So they're teaching online. Do they know how to teach online? I hope so, if they're at the Capstone, right? But also, if this is a different format and the expectations are different, how are we preparing instructors for this? And do instructors know about kind of all of this stuff, maybe even the baggage coming into the Capstone? Do they know the goal and purpose? Are they aligned with all of this? Do they know the curriculum and how students are coming in? What preparation is being done for our instructors? Boop, boop, boop. I have a question, but we don't have a lot of time. So I'm going to let you marinate and think about it, which is, what are your takeaways, lessons learned, snide remarks? Please don't, or do it in your head, and in your takeaways. And questions for me. I'll leave this up. I'm happy to hang out for just like the next 10 minutes or so for any questions if you have time. If not, please feel free to contact me. I can leave my email in the chat as well if you have anything that you would like to ask that you didn't get to because I did not leave enough time for you to do so. And then lastly, the end, thank you. I appreciate you all. These are a lot of articles that I read. So I'm happy to send any information on this too. But thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I hope you have a good rest of the conference. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to just hang out for a little bit. Unless Jessica doesn't want me to, you can kick me out too, Jessica. You're on mute.
I'm gonna stop the recording and I'll hang out.
Okay. If anyone even wants to hang out.